Shalom and welcome. This episode will cover that DNA proves an intelligent designer. And I believe that intelligent designer is God. As we dig deeper into DNA, I believe that it's important for you to know why I find DNA to be amazing and why DNA is so important. The reason why I'm making this video is because I often hear that people don't trust DNA, or that DNA is the invention of Europeans, or that DNA is Nazi science. I often hear these remarks from believers in the Abrahamic faiths. I don't believe this is the way we should look at DNA as believers. DNA can actually prove the existence of God because of how complex it is. This complexity truly shows how impossible it is for life to come into existence out of nowhere without some type of intelligent designer. The Word of the Most High actually harmonizes perfectly with biology, such as the origins of mankind. The scriptures say that the Most High created the first man, Adam, from the dust of the ground.
And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul.
Genesis chapter 2 verse 7 is a powerful verse because scientifically we do see evidence that the human body has earth elements. But first we have to ask the question, what is the Earth's crust made of? The Earth's crust is made of 46% oxygen, 28% silicon, 8% aluminum, 5% iron, 4% calcium, 3% sodium, 2% potassium, and 2% magnesium, as well as 2% of other elements. Now let's compare this to the human body. The human body is made up of 65% oxygen, 18% carbon, 9.5% hydrogen, 3.2% nitrogen, 1.5% calcium, 1.2% phosphorus, 0.4% potassium, 0.2% sulfur, 0.2% sodium, 0.2% chlorine, 0.1% magnesium, and 0.1% of other. Scientists even recently found that the human body has gold. According to the paper titled Fact of the Day, human body contains 0.2 milligrams of gold. Now don't start cutting yourself to get gold out of your body, because you won't bleed gold like the characters from the movie Gods of Egypt. You only have small traces of gold, but nonetheless an earth element. As we can see, the elements in the human body matches perfectly with the elements in the earth's surface. It's almost like we come from the dust of the ground. Also, all the oxygen that we have is very interesting. It's almost like we come from the breath of life. This is just one example of using DNA, biology, and science to harmonize with the scriptures, and there is plenty of other examples, but beginning with the origins of mankind should be a good starting point to harmonizing DNA with the scriptures. With that being said, as believers, we shouldn't fear DNA, but use it to our advantage. It shows the Most High, the Creator's handiwork, for we are fearfully and wonderfully made.
For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect. And in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them.
I compiled a list of videos that will prove that an intelligent designer exists because of DNA, and that the intelligent designer is the Most High. Let's begin. Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Non-profit educational or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
As a scientist,
microbiologist,
biochemist,
as a geologist,
neuroscientist,
physician,
biologist, and an engineer.
I think there is overwhelming evidence for intelligent design in nature.
I see intelligent design in the history of life,
in the genetic code of life,
in the molecular machines inside our cells,
in the complexity of life,
in the information embedded in living things,
in the operation of the human brain,
in the features of the human body,
in the chicken and egg causal circularity of life.
As a mathematician, I see great evidence of purpose in the universe.
As a molecular biologist, I see evidence for design everywhere I look, pretty much.
Nature is incomprehensible without inference to purpose and to intelligent design.
The properties of the universe as a whole, and our planet in particular, were fine-tuned for our benefit and for our survival.
In my view, the fossil evidence clearly points towards intelligent design.
I see life as designed because when I look at life at the molecular level, I see exquisite engineering.
all cells contain DNA, which include lots of information, and information is only the product of a mind.
Darwin thought living cells were just blobs of jelly, but when I look in a living cell, I see evidence of factories, machines, three-dimensional architectures, enormous amounts of encoded information.
There's power generators, there's manufacturing plants.
Life contains many features that we know from experience only arise from the activity of intelligent agents.
The genetic code is like a software program. It's like somebody would have had to be a coder, would have had to form this particular genetic code. When I see that order and design, I have a really hard time believing that random mutation and natural selection alone can cause the complexity and the diversity we see in life.
When you look at nature at large, what you see is incredible examples of innovation which surpass human technology. Examples include the flight capabilities of a hummingbird, sonar in bats, and greater innovation always implies greater intelligence from a designer.
If you read the message from the molecules, it's really clear. They say clearly, intelligent design, intelligent design, intelligent design is the source of life.
Lying to your kids. Nothing about DNA has helped with the evolution theory at all. DNA, which stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, is the most complex molecule in the universe. Unbelievably complicated molecule. That little DNA molecule, average person has 50 trillion cells in their body with 46 of those little molecules in each cell. 46 chromosome strands in each cell of your body. If you extracted all of it, it would only fill about 2 tablespoons. But if you took those DNA strands and unwound them, stretched them out, tied them together, one person's DNA would reach from Earth to the moon and back over 500,000 times. Round trips to the moon. They say the DNA holds more information than all computer programs ever written by man combined. IBM models the newest computers after DNA. The quantity of information is so vast, we have to invent new numbers to measure it. Not terabytes, petabytes, or exabytes, yottabytes, and zettabytes. All the words uttered by everyone who ever lived would amount to 5 exabytes. And your DNA and your chromosome holds more information than that. It is so unbelievably complex. If you typed out the code found in your DNA, when you got done typing, you'd have enough books to fill Grand Canyon 78 times. That's the instructions to make you. I'd say you're pretty special. Quite a list of instructions to make you. David said, I will praise thee, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. And he didn't have a microscope, and he could figure that out. Yeah. You know, from conception to birth, the baby adds 15,000 cells per minute to its body. Each one is more complicated than a space shuttle. How would you like to be in charge of the supply end of supplying a factory that is producing 15,000 space shuttles a minute? And it's your job to make sure they have all the nuts and bolts and screws and everything they need to put that thing together. Some of you women are saying, boy, I did it, and that's hard too. Sometimes they want pickles in the middle of the night, you know. What are you building down there anyway, you know? The probability of one DNA happening by chance has been calculated to be 1 in 10 to the 119,000th power. That's a big number when you figure the entire visible universe is about 10 to the 28th inches in diameter. DNA has not proven anything that would help the evolution theory. It's been made the problem much, much, much worse. But let's just assume that the chromosome number means something and that, you know, it could evolve. Okay, well then I did some research on this. I discovered penicillin has 2 chromosomes. That one had to evolve first. And then slowly over millions of years, they got some more chromosomes because they're complicated, you know, and turned into a fruit fly. You can see the similarity there. It's only got 8 chromosomes. And then very slowly it evolved some more chromosomes and became either a tomato or a housefly. Very tough to tell the difference. They're identical twins, you know. And then very slowly over millions of years it evolved into either a P or a B. You can see the similarity there, you know, P, B, very similar. And slowly became lettuce and then a carrot. And finally, when we got to 22 chromosomes, triplets. The possum, the redwood tree, and the kidney bean all have 22 chromosomes. Average scientists cannot tell them apart. Let's see, which one is which here? Okay, let's see, tree, possum, bean, and we have 46, folks. And if we can just get 2 more, the next step of human evolution, we're going to become a tobacco plant. I know some already smell like it. Sometimes I'll get on the elevator and I'll say, man, you're evolving, you're way ahead of me. And it probably won't happen in my lifetime, but we might get enough chromosomes someday to be either a dog or a chicken. They're twins too, you know. And then way down the road, you know, we're going to become a carp. They got double the chromosomes we do. And someday, star date 349572, we're going to become a fern. I was at a church one time, and this lady walked up to me afterwards, and she said, Mr. Hovind, I'm fern. I shook hands with that hand right there. I'll never wash it again. Hey, how come the evolutionists are always comparing things that fit their theory? Why don't they show us the things that don't fit their theory? Like, let's just say we're going to examine how things evolved based upon how long they lived. Well, we could arrange animals by how long they live, and we'll find out the hamster evolved first, slowly turned into a cat, and then a canary, and then a dog, and then a chimpanzee, and an alligator, elephant, horse, turtle, and human. We made it, folks. We made it. Let's arrange the animals based on how long they're pregnant, their gestation period. Well, in that case, the possum, only 13 days. How'd you like that, ladies? Only be pregnant for 13 days. Not bad, huh? Yeah, I'd have a bunch of kids in. Slowly evolved into a hamster, then a rat, then a rabbit, kangaroo, on down the list, and the elephant. 640 days. They are the winner. The most evolved creature on earth. Or maybe, you can see here the cat and the dog are identical twins, you know. Maybe we should arrange them based on how much they weigh in their adult form. Well, the shrew only weighs 4 grams. Slowly it became a mouse. And very slowly, over billions of years, became a whale. The whale's the most evolved now. Why don't they show us these charts, huh? And why is it that amphibians have 5 times more DNA than mammals, and some amoeba have 1,000 times more DNA? They don't tell us these things because it doesn't fit their theory. It's impossible to arrange in any sort of evolutionary series based on just one little bit of facts. You better find all the facts. You find out this evolution theory fails miserably. But they tell the kids, we're going to think critically. Boys and girls, there are 20 kinds of amino acids. That's a fact. Explain how this fact supports the idea that all life shares a common ancestor. How's a Christian kid supposed to answer that for homework for Monday? Don't you see a built-in assumption in this question? That's not learning to think critically. Would the kid be allowed, teacher, to explain how this fact that all life forms have 20 amino acids, would the kid be allowed to say, maybe that proves the intelligence of a common designer? Maybe God gave all the animals the same basic 20 amino acids so that we don't have to just eat each other, you know. I mean, if they're all totally different, wildly different kinds, then we could only eat other humans. But see, God made it this way so the brown cow can eat the green grass and give the white milk and make the yellow butter, and I eat it and get the blonde hair. Maybe that's why there's all the same basic building blocks. Yeah. One of the lies they face in the textbooks is this idea that all these similarities prove a common ancestor.
If you look at the detailed details of biochemistry, molecular biology, you might find a signature of some sort of designer. In biology, I suppose it would have to be the double helix, the Watson and Crick discovery of the structure of DNA, which was far more than just the discovery, the crystallographic work, discovering the structure of a big molecule. Because what that led up to was a major revolution in which much of biology became a sort of branch of information technology. The consequence of the Watson-Crick discovery, with all that it led on to, the DNA code and the sort of various genome projects that are going on now, is that genes, which from my point of view are absolutely central to biology, genes are information. They are coded information. It even looks like computer information. I mean, a chromosome is a great long computer tape. It's linear, it runs one-dimensional, digital code. It's not binary, it's quaternary, but apart from that, it's just the same as computer tape. It's read in sequence. It's copied and pasted from one part of the organism to another in just the same way as a computer programmer would copy and paste. So biology has turned into computer science.
Whereas we thought that only a minority of the genome was doing something, namely that minority which actually codes for protein. And now we find that actually the majority of it's doing something. What it's doing is calling into action the protein coding genes. So you can think of the protein coding genes as being the sort of toolbox of subroutines, which is pretty much common to all mammals. I mean, all mice and men have the same number, roughly speaking, of protein coding genes, and that's always been a bit of a blow to the self-esteem of humanity. But what the point is, that was just the subroutines that are called into being. The program that's calling them into action is the rest, which had previously been written off as junk.
An individual organism is a throwaway survival machine for the self-replicating coded information which it contains. And the fate of that coded information is crucially bound up with the fate of the body in which it sits. The origin of life, the chemical circumstances that gave rise to the first self-replicating molecule, the first proto-gene. The origin of life is something we don't know anything about, and we want to know something about it, and I would love to know how life actually got started, the origin of the first self-replicating entity. Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
What was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, and how did that happen?
I told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anybody.
Nor has anyone else.
Can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Can you just stop one?
Well, some scientists are now saying it takes more faith to believe in evolution than it does to believe in a creator. They say new discoveries inside DNA are the latest evidence of an intelligent design behind all creation. John Jessup explains.
Darwin's theory of evolution rests on the idea that the incredibly complex web of life today all evolved from simple chemicals and cells. No creator was necessary, just chance and the powers of the fittest forms of life to survive and adapt. But Darwin couldn't see into cells and DNA like scientists of the modern age. He couldn't know these building blocks of life work because of intricate little machines in each cell, so intricate there's no chance they could simply evolve. Darwin couldn't know that DNA functions, life itself functions, because of incredibly complex code, way beyond what even the most brilliant computer programmers have devised. Secular scientists often mock the simple faith of those who believe in an unseen God, but statisticians say the odds are impossible this incredibly intricate, elegant code could ever just evolve, and thus it takes much more faith to believe in such chance than it does to believe an intelligent designer is behind this code at the core of all life. Science philosopher Stephen Meyer, in his book Signature in the Cell, lays out the evidence for such intelligent design, and he refutes the arguments that the theory of intelligent design is just religion and not true science. It's a battle at the very origin and meaning of life that the secular media rarely allow to break out into the open. John Jessup, CBN News.
Well, Stephen Meyer joins us now. He's the director of the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington. Stephen, it's great to have you here.
It's nice to be with you,
It's a real
Gordon.
privilege. Yeah. Let's take that question that was in the piece just head on. What do you say to people that say, well, intelligent design is just religion in another form?
Well, the theory is based on scientific discoveries such as the fine-tuning of the laws of physics and chemistry, the discovery of the intricate nanotechnology, the little miniature machines that have been discovered in cells, rotary engines, sliding clamps, information processing systems. And for me, the most compelling evidence of design is the evidence of design that you find in the digital code that's embedded in the DNA molecule, a 4-character digital code that directs the construction of all the machinery that the cell needs to stay alive. So it's I think, a new day in science. It's an evidence-based theory, not a theory based on religious authority. It may have religious implications, maybe even friendly to religious belief. I think it is myself, but it's based on scientific evidence and even a standard method of scientific reasoning.
Well, let's just get your background so we kind of lay some groundwork here. You have a background in physics, and then you have a doctorate from Cambridge.
Right. I actually started in the field of geophysics. And my first job was with an oil company. My Texan bosses told me my job was to look for oil out in the Gulf. Now they've got a lot of oil out in the Gulf.
They found a lot of oil out there, and now they don't want to find it.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's take a look at the critics. And one of the criticisms I hear of intelligent design is it's all trying to get us to think of creation as the Earth is 6,000 years old, the dinosaurs and mastodons all roam together. Is that part of this or no?
No, the theory of intelligent design is really not about about the age of the Earth. It's about the ability to detect the effects of intelligence, to detect an intelligent cause and the effects they leave behind. Let me give a simple example. If you go to the Dakotas and you see the faces in Mount Rushmore, the president's faces, you'll immediately recognize that this wasn't something that was produced by wind and erosion or some purely natural forces. Instead, there was a sculptor or maybe many sculptors involved. Now, inside cells, we don't have little faces, but we have other indicators of intelligence. We have these little miniature machines we were talking about, and most importantly, we have the digital digital code that's stored in the DNA molecule. The key discovery came in 1957, 4 years after Watson and Crick discovered the beautiful double helical shape of the DNA molecule. Francis Crick had an insight, it was called the sequence hypothesis, when he realized that there are 4 chemicals that run down the spine of the DNA molecule, and they function just like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters, zeros and ones in a section of machine code. In fact, Bill Gates has said that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any we've ever created. And that's highly suggestive because we know from experience that software programs always come from programmers, and that information generally, in whatever form we find it, whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription or a headline in a newspaper, or a paragraph in a book, or information embedded in a radio signal, whenever we find information and we trace it back to its source, we always come to an intelligent mind, to not an undirected immaterial process. It's always intelligence that produces information.
What do you do with the critique that, I think we've all sort of heard this one, that if you take a chimpanzee and a typewriter and give him an infinite amount of time, at some point he's going to come out with a Shakespeare play?
Well, that's the rub. We don't have an infinite amount of time. Except the standard age for the origin of the universe, grant 13, 14 billion years, the complexity of a single protein, which is produced by the information on a strand of DNA. So the amount of information required is so improbable, it's so complex, that if every event, and this is a calculation I make in the book, if every event from the origin of the universe till now had been devoted to searching for one of the possible ways of arranging all of the 4 characters in the DNA molecule, or the corresponding amino acids and proteins, you wouldn't have enough time to search but a tiny fraction of all of the possible ways of arranging things. Think of the Scrabble letters on a table. You've got to imagine a huge heap of Scrabble letters, and you've got to find a sentence of that length by chance as you look through there. There's so many possible ways of arranging them. It's like looking for a needle in a great big haystack the size of the universe and only having a tiny, tiny amount of time to search.
Your book goes into the statistical analysis and give us an idea of the time frame involved, the numbers involved in terms of statistical probability that this could arise by accident.
Well, I show that, again, if every event, and an event here is defined as just an interaction of elementary particles. Every event that had taken place since the Big Bang had been devoted to searching, in a random trial and error way for a single functional gene or protein. There wouldn't be enough time to search but one part out of a trillion possibilities. So the chance hypothesis has really been rejected by leading origin of life scientists. It's just not credible. That's not where the action is. Even people who don't accept design don't think chance is credible. They're looking for other undirected naturalistic processes to try to explain the origin of information. But as I show in the book, those other approaches have also failed. And yet we know of a cause which is capable of producing information, and that's intelligence. In fact, that's the only known cause of which we know, and therefore that's why I argue that it's the best explanation. In fact, just an interesting irony in this is that I actually, in the book, developed the case for intelligent design using Darwin's own method of scientific reasoning. He had a key principle of reasoning, which is that if you're trying to explain something in the remote past, you should invoke a cause or causes which are known to produce the effect you're trying to explain. What are we trying to explain? Information. What do we know from our uniform experience about what produces information? Only one kind of cause, and that's intelligence. So the presence of information in DNA is a decisive indicator of prior intelligent activity. Information points back to intelligence.
And the fact that this information changes and can change rapidly indicates that there is even active interference. Even Darwin noted the shale deposits in Wales and the Cambrian explosion, that there is a huge explosion of diversity happening within species in a very short geological time.
Well, there's 2 senses of change here. One is the kind of things that we observe, which are mutations, but those types of changes tend to degrade the information, and they don't seem to be an explanation for where it came from in the first place as a result. The other kind of change is the change you see in the history of life when you see these sudden infusions of new biological form, and we now know, just like in the computer world, if you want to give your computer a new function, you have to provide new code. If you have a new organism that performs new kinds of biological functions, you also need code, and that's the big question. Where did all that information come from in the Cambrian explosion, for example, or in these other huge events in the history of life where you have a huge infusion of new forms of life and therefore new information? Where did it come from? The only known cause of information is, again, intelligence.
Now that we're applying our intelligence to DNA,
yes,
and are literally changing the code, we just had this huge breakthrough where an assembled piece of DNA was put into a cell and it replicated. What are the implications for that?
I'm glad you asked that. There's a lot of confusion about this recent news story about Craig Venter's work. It's a brilliant technological achievement, but it is not producing, it was not the achievement that it was touted as achieving. It's not artificial life. What he did was he took a piece of DNA, he copied it, and then put the same, DNA contains information, he put the same information strand back into a cell, and the cell was able to read it. It'd be like if you wanted to have a copy of a file on my desktop. I made a file for you, we popped it in your computer, and then you said, look, my computer can read it. I've created a computer. All the important information processing systems and all the other cellular processes were present in that pre-existing bacterium. All that was done was added a gene with some information, and it was put into the system. It was an artificially copied gene, but it was put into a pre-existing life form. So
he rearranged it.
Well, essentially, he took a component and copied it, and then put it back into an existing organism.
Do you see a time where we could literally design organisms?
I don't. I think we really don't understand what life is. DNA is an unbelievably complex molecule. It's full of code, and that is a fascinating thing. But DNA alone does not make an organism. We have to have all the information processing system that is provided by proteins. We have to have the cell membrane, and it's a functionally integrated system. Each one of these systems depends on the other in a tightly integrated way that engineers would understand. So we really don't have a sense of what would be required to design a whole organism. We know there's a lot of the necessary parts, but getting them all to fit together in the way that they do in an actual organism, it's a very difficult thing to conceive.
So we're back to, which came first, the chicken or the egg. Without a fully formed system, you don't have either one.
Well, right. And one of the on my website, there's an animation that I think your viewers might enjoy. It shows exactly how the digital code in DNA directs the construction of the protein machines and protein parts that the cell needs to stay alive. It's a fascinating process, and some parts of it are very mechanical. It's very much like what goes on at Boeing or Ford, where engineers will design some parts that they want to build. They'll literally codify that design in digital code. It will be sent down a wire, translated into a machine code, and then that information will be used to direct, if you're trying to build an airplane wing, for example, exactly where the robotic arm places the rivets or something. So we have systems that we've now designed where we use digital information to construct mechanical parts. That's what's going on inside the cell, and it's an awesome system. And I've got a little piece of animation on my website that would, I think, bring that to life, where one picture's worth 1,000 words type of thing.
What do you say to evolutionists that claim that whole appearance of design, either the sort of the assembly line construction of the processes within a cell, or ecosystems that depend, one species is necessarily dependent on another, or even the process of chicken and egg, that all of that appearance of design is mere illusion?
Well, that's been the standard Darwinian argument since 1859, but what many people don't realize is that Darwin never addressed the question of the origin of the first life, and in the 150 years since then, scientists have been unsuccessful in explaining the origin of the code and the origin of this chicken and egg relationship that you correctly referred to. DNA encodes for proteins, but proteins are necessary to read the information on DNA, and it's hard to imagine one without the other. And in my book, I look at the different attempts that people have made to try to explain that intricate complexity. The Darwinian idea was that things look designed, but they're not really designed because there's an undirected process, namely natural selection acting on random mutations that can mimic the powers of a designing intelligence. But that explanation is not adequate to explain the origin of the first life, for the simple reason that natural selection isn't even a factor until you have life. And I think natural selection also fails to explain some of the higher orders of form and complexity we see in higher animals, not just the first cell. So I think that explanation of apparent design only works if you've got a mechanism that's sufficient to produce all the appearance of design without any guiding hand involved. But I don't think that's the case scientifically anymore. I think what we're looking at is evidence of real design. These designer substitute mechanisms have failed to explain the origin of the information you need to build the first life, and also the higher orders of form that arise in the history of life.
Well, Stephen and I can talk for a long time, but I've been told I got to wrap. So, Signature in the Cell, it's available. It's one of the top-selling science books in the country today, and I encourage you to get a copy. Get informed. It's available in bookstores, and if you want to go to Stephen's animation, all you have to do is log on to cbn.com, and we'll direct you.
If simple water molecules that form ice crystals exhibit magnificent structure, consider the design ingenuity behind large, complex molecules, such as DNA. DNA contains the blueprint for all life and is by far the densest information storage mechanism known in the universe. For example, the amount of information contained in a pinhead volume of DNA would fill a stack of books 500 times higher than from here to the moon. The program code and design of such an incredible system indicates a supremely intelligent designer.
The evidence to me that just cries out that there's a God is the study of DNA. DNA is a very powerful, massive information storage system. In fact, DNA that makes up our genes actually is like books of information that's read by a language system. It's absolutely phenomenal. And scientists know today that languages, a code, only come from an intelligence, and information only comes from information. Nobody's ever seen matter by itself give rise to a code. Nobody's ever seen matter by itself give rise to information. And as you look at DNA, it actually cries out, in the beginning, God created the universe.
We all begin as a single cell the size of a period at the end of a sentence. How does that cell know how to build a body with 100 trillion cells in it, thousands of different kinds, and each one of them is so complex, nanochemical machinery beyond our comprehension how it works, and encoded is the instruction manual. It's the manufacturer's manual how to build and operate every part of this incredible body made up of 100 trillion cells.
Furthermore, DNA is a three-dimensional molecule that is self-replicating. Each molecule is able to make an identical copy quickly and efficiently. The Lord has even programmed DNA to detect and correct replication errors. These sophisticated capabilities far exceed man's means.
God has created the DNA molecule in such a way that it is self-correcting. There are special proteins called enzymes that go up and down the DNA molecule looking for and making repairs on a minute-by-minute, second-by-second basis. God created us with a DNA code that actually has what we call editase or editorial type enzymes. Just as an editor reads a newspaper or a book looking for mistakes, so God has created special enzymes that go up and down our DNA molecule, repairing the mistakes in ways that are unbelievably complex.
There are many examples in creation of things that demonstrate the biblical God. One would be in our very DNA. Our DNA has information in it. And there is a whole field of scientific study called information science, which studies how information originates, how it's transmitted, and so on. And one of the laws of information science says that information never originates by itself in matter, never spontaneously comes about. Anytime we trace the copying of information back to its source, it always comes back to a mind. And since we have creative information in DNA, that tells me that DNA comes from intelligence. It's not something that could possibly come about through millions of years of mutations and natural selection. That just won't work.
Yet even the DNA molecule is simple compared to cells. All life consists of cells, and each cell functions as a miniature city. When we consider that a human body consists of trillions of cells working together as one unit, we should be in humble awe of our Creator's intimate care and perfect wisdom.
On Earth, when it is a fact that life can't come from non-life. All living things on Earth are made up of cells, so what are the chances that even a first cell could have accidentally formed? About 150 years ago, when Charles Darwin was alive, the cell was considered to be something like a simple, unsophisticated microscopic blob of jello. As a result of recent discoveries, however, we now know just how amazingly complex these extraordinarily small cells are. The adult human body contains 100 trillion cells of various sizes. 10,000 average-size human cells could fit on the head of a pin, and every single cell contains information equivalent to about 4,000 books. The information for all the cells in one adult in book form would completely fill the Grand Canyon more than 75 times. The cell is similar to a supercomputer but microscopic in size. The cell could also be viewed as an amazingly miniature city, with an elaborate network of connected assembly lines with numerous molecular protein machines, carrying out different tasks which make the cell work. For example, in the cell there are little molecular trucks that travel over microscopic highway-like structures carrying materials around the cell. One example of a molecular machine in the cell is the Flagellar Motor that some bacteria use to swim. It is a molecular rotary motor that has a whip-like tail that can operate at up to 100,000 revolutions per minute. This is a picture of the Flagellar Motor magnified more than 50,000 times. It is 1/100,000th of an inch long. 8 million of these tiny motors would fit inside the cross-section of a human hair. You can see the details of its construction. It is made up of 30 different protein parts. It looks like it was designed by an engineer. The Flagellar Motor is extremely similar to an electric motor. Rotating forward and backward, the Flagellar Motor drives a bacterium through extremely sticky liquid conditions. As a result of the Flagellar Motor, a bacterium's top swimming speed is estimated to be the same as a human swimming at 60 miles per hour. If that doesn't sound impressive to you, consider that the fastest swimming speed of a human ever recorded was about 5.5 miles per hour. Thus, the bacterium using the Flagellar Motor can move about 11 times faster than the fastest human swimmer ever recorded. All 30 distinct parts of the Flagellar Motor are essential, so if you remove one of the parts it will not work at all and the bacterium will die. The Flagellar Motor is similar to a mousetrap. For a mousetrap to work, you need all the different parts, and if you remove one of the parts of the trap won't work at all. The construction process of the Flagellar Motor requires all 30 different interacting parts to be assembled correctly and placed at the proper locations at the proper time. The construction process also requires instructions, translation, and feedback within the cell at both the beginning and end of the process. If all this does not happen, these amazingly tiny machines or their various individual parts will not be built or assembled correctly. But how would these numerous microscopic machines or parts know where to go and how to build things correctly in an evolutionary system? They wouldn't. It would be impossible. These facts refute and eliminate Darwinian evolution, which is, by definition, a blind, undirected process without either plan or purpose. Cells are mostly made up of proteins. A typical cell uses thousands of different kinds of proteins. To get even the simplest cell would take at least 600 different protein molecules. Proteins are made of amino acids. A single functioning protein is typically made from a chain of between 50 to 1,000 amino acids. Some proteins require a chain of thousands of properly sequenced amino acids. Every time a new amino acid is joined to a chain, it must form a chemical bond called a peptide bond in order to successfully join with the other amino acids in the chain. Left-handed and right-handed amino acids are produced with about the same frequency, but only left-handed amino acids can be selected for use in a chain to make a protein. Evolutionists do not have any idea why proteins only use left-handed amino acids. Every amino acid in the long chain also has to be a specific amino acid. There are 20 different types that can be selected, and they need to be placed in the correct order in the chain in order to form a protein. The amino acids are placed in the exact right order because of a molecule in the cell called DNA. DNA could be described as a master blueprint, information code, or special language that uses a 4-letter chemical alphabet. The chemical letters or code in DNA are the set of instructions for the cell's machines on how to correctly assemble amino acids in chains to build proteins. If the DNA is not present from the very beginning, the amino acids will not be correctly selected and placed in the proper order. As a result, a protein will never form and the cell will not survive. DNA can't function without at least 75 pre-existing proteins, but proteins are produced only by DNA. Since each needs the other, they must have come into existence at the exact same time by God. This fact eliminates evolution. A DNA fiber is only about 2/millionths of a millimeter thick. While DNA is not thick and is incredibly small, it is extremely long when uncoiled. In fact, if the DNA in just one of your cells were uncoiled, connected, and stretched out, it would be over 7 feet long. It would be so thin that its details could not be seen even under an electron microscope. If all the DNA in your body were placed end to end, it would stretch from here to the moon more than 500,000 times. If you took a set of DNA from every person who ever lived and placed it in a pile, it would weigh less than an aspirin. Yet the information storage density of DNA is many times greater than the most advanced silicon computer chip. Bill Gates described DNA saying, quote, "DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created." But having the complex DNA instruction program is not enough by itself. Other things in the cell must be able to understand and use DNA's information program. In other words, the highly complex DNA program is actually worthless unless you also have a system inside the cell that can understand the DNA language. To understand this better, imagine that DNA is a complex CD or DVD disc. But if you don't also have a machine or system that can read, understand, and utilize the information on the disc is worthless. Therefore, other things in the cell need to understand and be able to use the DNA information program in order to build things correctly. If not, the cell will die. DNA is able to make an identical copy of itself. God also programmed DNA to detect and correct errors. There are special proofreading protein machines that constantly travel up and down the DNA molecule looking for any errors requiring correction. If any problems are detected, repairs are made immediately. This whole process is incredibly complex. The information contained in DNA proves that life doesn't just consist of matter and energy. It also contains information. Information can only come from an intelligent source that put the information there. Another function of DNA is that it is the program that God uses to build what you look like, your hair color, your height, etc. As mentioned earlier, each adult human body has about 100 trillion cells, but at your conception you were only one cell. Incredibly, you began your existence no larger than the head of a pin. Yet all the complex information that physically defined you and every organ in your body was there, contained in that one cell. Within 1 month of your conception, your eyes, ears, and lungs developed. Billions of new cells formed and your size increased by over 10,000 times. Shortly after the first month, the speed at which you were rapidly growing slowed down dramatically. If it didn't slow down and your speed of growth stayed the same, you would have weighed 3,000 pounds at birth. After 2 months, you were only 3 to 4 centimeters long, still small enough to fit inside a walnut shell. There is no evolutionary explanation for the incredible complexity involved in conception and birth, or even a reason for reproduction itself. Evolutionists believe the amazingly complex, radically different yet complementary reproductive systems for all the different kinds of life happen to develop by chance, completely and independently at the same time. Just a slight incompatibility in one of the two systems would make both reproductive systems useless, and life would become extinct. Also, how would reproduction have happened in the beginning if there only had been a male and not a female? How would reproduction occur without reproductive systems or organs before they, quote, evolved? According to evolutionists, humans evolved from land creatures which evolved from fish. But how would the first fish make it onto land and survive out of the water? How did the animals and human beings survive without having organs, limbs, and other things critical to life as these things were, quote, evolving? Also, not one transitional fossil has ever been discovered that shows one kind of animal evolving into another kind of animal. And the so-called missing link fossils, which some use to argue that apes evolved into human beings, have all been shown to be fully ape, fully human, or fake. Evolutionists also have no explanation for consciousness or for the origin of the immune system. For example, white blood cells attack bad bacteria in our body. White blood cells will actually search out and chase down bad bacteria on seek and destroy missions. In order to do this, they must have the programmed information that enables them to tell the difference between friend and foe. Unless all of this was in place and working from the beginning of life, a requirement that rules out evolution, bacteria and other agents of disease would have won, and we would not have survived. Evolutionists have no explanation for the extremely complex, yet perfect precision in which the body clots blood. Disaster can happen if blood doesn't clot at the proper time or in the proper place. If blood were to start clotting in the wrong place, for example in your lung or in your brain, you could die. If blood began to clot too long after too much blood had drained or didn't cover the entire cut, you could die. If the blood clotting isn't restricted to the cut area alone, your entire blood system could solidify. Evolution has no explanation for blood clotting. For how would your body automatically know when and where to start the blood clotting process unless there is intelligent internal information to guide it? And speaking of blood, what came first, blood or the heart that pumps blood? Did skin evolve before blood? If so, how did it survive? The truth is that all these things had to be completely developed and present together from the beginning in order for humanity to survive. The 3-pound human brain is the most complex and orderly arrangement of matter in the universe. The adult human brain contains 10 to the 14th power. That's 100,000 billion electrical connections. That's more than all the electrical connections and all the electrical appliances in the world. On the back of your eyeball is the retina. It is less than 1 square inch, yet that 1 square inch contains over 137 million light-sensitive cells, all of which are wired to the brain. The human eye can heal itself and is self-cleaning. The eye also has automatic focusing, enabling a person to distinguish millions of colors. If your eye were off even by a slight degree, you would see double. These facts are just some of the evidence that proves we were created by God, and we find clear evidence of God's creative power and intelligence not only in the design of man, but also in the incredible complexity of animals and insects. This is covered in detail in the video series Incredible Creatures That Defy Evolution. Some believe that the complexity of life in the universe can be explained by the possibility that an alien race created it. But do you really believe that aliens have the power to create the Earth? Or how about something the size of the Sun? Over 1 million Earths could fit inside the Sun. The Sun is also very hot. So how would aliens go about putting the Sun together and constructing it? How would they get close enough to the Sun when building it? Or move away from it quickly enough without dying after starting it up? The conditions outside Earth and outer space are, according to the evidence, too hostile for life to exist. For example, prolonged exposure to the cosmic rays in outer space can be fatal. Just the temperature extremes in outer space would make almost any form of life either too incredibly hot or too cold. There are also poisonous gases, deadly radiation, gigantic explosions, extreme gravitational forces, and the lack of proper atmospheres and chemical elements for life to exist. Yet a large number of astronomers believe that life evolved on Earth, and therefore, according to them, it must have also evolved on other planets in space. However, if this were true, many alien races on other planets much older than our own should exist. Some of them would be far more technologically advanced than we are. As a result, they would have sent a radio signal through space that we could pick up, or they would have reached us with their aircraft or robots. But we have never found any alien robots, any aliens, any alien aircraft, or any pieces of their aircraft. Here are some of the reported flying characteristics of UFOs. While in flight, UFOs will frequently change size, color, or shape. Multiple UFOs will merge into one UFO, and one UFO will instantly change into many UFOs. Many UFO witnesses have described these instant changes to the size and shape of UFOs by saying that the UFOs seemed as if they were alive. UFOs sometimes show up on photographs, but other times they do not. Most witnesses of UFOs do not report seeing an object or craft, but an unusual light moving around the sky. Sometimes UFOs instantly appear and disappear right in front of people, and will also pass right through the ground or physical objects. This type of behavior means that UFOs could not be from the material world, but would have to be some kind of spiritual phenomenon. Based on the observed activity of UFOs, many of the world's top UFO researchers no longer believe that UFOs can be from the material world. Also, most of the so-called UFO abductees can only, quote, remember their, quote, experiences after being put under hypnosis, proving that their so-called experiences with aliens were not real. These issues are covered in much more detail in my book, UFOs, Demonic Activity and Elaborate Hoaxes Meant to Deceive Mankind. If ETs really existed, it wouldn't take them very long to discover what they needed to know about Earthlings. As a consequence, they would have already taken us over, destroyed us, or revealed themselves clearly to humanity. The organization SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, has been scanning the skies for decades looking for intelligent life. But they have never picked up even one signal from outer space that would indicate an alien race exists. Those searching for ETs have said that if they did pick up even one complex signal, it would prove that an intelligence must have produced it. But why don't they apply that same standard and employ the same thought process to DNA? If they did, they would realize that the complex information in DNA proves that an intelligence put it there. Because whenever you find complex information, it is always traced back to a mind. For the best...
Chances are, if you've heard anything about intelligent design, you've heard that it's a faith-based, not a science-based idea. Or maybe you've even heard it's religion masquerading as science. Is that true? Well, why don't you decide? According to evolutionary biologists, such as Richard Dawkins of Oxford University, living systems give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. But that appearance is merely an illusion. Why? Well, according to Dawkins and his followers, wholly undirected processes such as natural selection and random mutations can produce the intricate design-like structures in living systems. In their view, natural selection can mimic the powers of a designing intelligence without being guided or directed in any way. In contrast, the proponents of intelligent design argue that there are telltale features of living systems and the universe that are best explained by a designing intelligence. So what telltale signs of intelligence are we talking about? There are many, but let's focus here on just one: the digital code stored in the DNA molecule. In 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick mapped out the structure of the DNA molecule. Along the interior of their famed double helix, they discovered a 4-character code at work. They soon realized that sequences of precisely positioned chemicals, called nucleotide bases, store and transmit the assembly instructions, the information, for building the crucial protein molecules that cells need to survive. No protein molecules, no life. Crick later proposed that the chemical constituents in DNA function like letters in a written language or digital symbols in a computer code. Just as well-functioning computer code depends upon precise sequences of zeros and ones, so too does the function of the DNA molecule depend upon the specific arrangement of chemical bases along the spine of the double helix. Famed biotech specialist Leroy Hood describes the information stored in DNA as digital code. Even Richard Dawkins has acknowledged The machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. But where did this information, this digital code, come from? Today, this question lies at the heart of a great scientific mystery, the mystery of the origin of life. Building a living cell requires many proteins, and building proteins requires genetic information in DNA or some other equivalent molecule. Yet to date, no theory of undirected chemical evolution can explain the origin of the digital information needed to build the first living cell from simpler, non-living chemicals. In other words, the problem of getting life from non-life. Why is this a problem? There is simply too much information in the cell to be explained by chance alone. The probability of generating a section of DNA code capable of building just one functional protein by chance is vanishingly small, even taking into account the multi-billion-year history of the universe. And even the simplest living cells require hundreds of proteins. Thus, the given enough time, anything is possible argument no longer works. Origin of life researchers agree. The chance hypothesis has failed. Chemistry doesn't help us either. Unlike basic chemical compounds, like a crystal of salt, the chemical letters in the DNA message do not arrange themselves as a result of mutual attraction. Saying otherwise would be like saying that the message in a newspaper headline could spontaneously emerge because of the way ink sticks to paper. Clearly something else is at work. In this case, a newspaper editor. Yet proponents of intelligent design do not argue for the theory because all these other theories, chance, chemical laws, or some combination, have failed. Instead, they argue for intelligent design because our uniform and repeated experience, the basis of all scientific reasoning, shows that systems with digital information invariably arise from intelligence. DNA functions like a software program. We know from experience that software comes from programmers. We know that information, whether inscribed in hieroglyphics, written in a book, or encoded in a radio signal, always arises from an intelligent source. So the discovery of information at the foundation of life in even the simplest living cells provides strong grounds for inferring that a designing intelligence played a role in the origin of life. So contrary to what you may have heard, intelligent design is not based on religion, but on scientific discoveries. It is also based on the same method of scientific reasoning that Charles Darwin used, a method that relies on our uniform experience of cause and effect to guide our theories about what happened in the past. You may still wish to dismiss the theory of intelligent design. You're free to believe whatever you like, but you'll have a hard time doing so based on the science.
Rob, when we talk about the diversity of life, there are really diverse creatures in this pool.
This one little touch tank is filled with amazing things.
So each of these kinds, from the Genesis paradigm, each of these were created, and yet there's some similarities between them.
Similarities and differences, and that's what we see across the entire realm of life, similarities and differences.
So what makes them different?
Well, genetically, they're very similar. They have the same biochemistry. They have they share most of their genes in common. But there are developmental genes, they're called Hox genes, that set up these patterns in the animal as it develops, that they develop from a single cell, just like you and I do. But just like my left and right hand are mirror images of one another, it's because there are genes that set up inside of me that did patterns and sequences and timing, such to the point where as I grew my little arm buds, my hands popped out and they look almost the same. Well, for these guys, there are Hox genes. That in one of them, they set up a 5-fold symmetry. Another, they set up a 10-fold symmetry. Another one, they make this long, skinny animal. There are these master computer programs that have a tremendous downstream effect. They control the development of the embryo in these amazing ways.
So it's like we have these programs that are creating all this diversity, but there's a master program, almost like an operating system.
Absolutely. That operating system, actually, scientists have compared the operating system of a simple bacterium to the Linux operating system.
Which is very, very complex.
Very complex, but when we look at it, there's a lot of computer programming in life. And so what we've seen is just like in our operating systems, life has some master modules and then has some middle level programs that control all the output. We call that proteins and sugars and action. Computer systems, they've got your operating system that controls a lot of middle level managers, you know, do this to the sound card, do this to video card, that controls all the outputs. But it's really funny, when we look at the way life is structured, it's a lot more optimally designed. You have less high level programs controlling less middle level programs controlling a lot more outputs. Our computer programs are top heavy. We have a lot of stuff up here controlling a little bit of stuff down here because we're not quite as smart as God.
So what you're saying, when we look at this from a molecular or genetic perspective, what we're finding is really a fascinating design in all of that.
Absolutely. And when you talk about the standard paradigm, the standard evolutionary story, we run into great difficulties when we get to these Hox genes, to these master program modules. Because, yeah, you can take a starfish like that and you can change its size a little bit. You might change its color a little bit. But if you want to get that starfish to turn into a radically different organism, you don't tweak these little things. You have to tweak the high-level operating system, and that usually causes a downstream catastrophe. I mean, imagine if you're programming a computer, right? You can change a 1 or a 0 in an output, and maybe now your letters are blue instead of white on the screen. Big deal. But if you want to randomly change the core operating system, how many changes are possible that don't cause disaster? I mean, almost all changes would ruin the whole system.
From a computer scientist perspective, I can tell you, we call that system software sometimes. That's the fundamental heart of that whole system. If you have a problem down there, the whole thing breaks down.
And when someone wants to change that, how many people have to think for how long to make a simple change to the basic programming?
That's tough, because once you start monkeying with that operating system, with that system software, you have to be very careful because you'll upset the whole thing.
Yeah, and that's what we see in life.
But what we've heard in the conventional paradigm, the conventional story tells us that it's those random changes that has brought about all of this.
Sure, back in the 1800s, when life was simple, when they didn't know what was happening inside the cell, they didn't know how complex genetics was, you could imagine all sorts of things. I mean, you could imagine a cell turning into a square or a circle or changing color or growing a spike or a hair. No problem. But now that we know what actually happens behind the scenes, the story gets a lot more complicated. You see, the more complex life becomes, the less possible evolutionary theory becomes. It can only work if life is really, really simple, and life is not simple. We've had a revolution in technology just the last 10 or 15 years that our understanding of life has skyrocketed, and the standard paradigm's ability to explain life has plummeted.
So this is that concept of a black box. Like Darwin really couldn't see inside that, and so he thought it was simple. But what you're saying is that now we're finding it's extremely complex.
Yes, and it's complex at all levels. I mean, structurally it's complex, functionally it's complex, biochemistry is unbelievably complex, genetics is, our understanding of genetics is only getting more complex over time.
What are we finding now as we're studying genetics? What are kind of the things that we see now that we didn't see 50 years ago?
Well, 50 years ago, they had this simple idea that you have a gene and a gene makes a protein. That's been blown out of the water. We now know that genes are involved in making dozens, if not hundreds of proteins, and different pieces of genes are used in different proteins at different times in the cell cycle, different times in life, under different conditions, in different cells. Most of your cells in your body, they produce similar proteins than other cells, but they're different. So your brain cells actually produce different versions of proteins than your liver cells produce.
So how's that possible? I mean, how do they do that?
It's dynamic programming. You have a gene, and this piece is used over here or over there or over there. And there's little teeny programs inside the DNA that control when and where and how to use that piece. But just recently I read a paper about actually shifting of the information in the genes. So if you start at letter number 1, you can read out this information. If you start at letter number 2, you get a totally different information. How on earth did that evolve like that? I mean, if you think of, if you read a story, maybe you're reading a story talking about some swashbuckling pirate. But if you start the second letter, it's a chocolate chip cookie recipe. We can't write that. There's no way we could intelligently program multiple levels of information into the same story. And that's what we see in life. And if we can't do it intelligently, it's not going to happen randomly.
We're talking about something that is beyond imagination in terms of the complexity, even from the standpoint of the kind of things we've done with software, and we've done some amazing things with software. But that appears to be is not even close to what you're talking about.
I like to say that the genome is 4-dimensional. In software, we write in lines of code.
Correct.
Well, in mathematics, we learned a line is a 1-dimensional object. It just has length. So you could actually take a computer program and just write from left to right for millions of characters. Now, on our screens, we put carriage returns in there so we can read it. But the computer doesn't know that. It ignores the carriage returns. It's just a line. Well, DNA is a line. So in the naive concept of DNA, we had a line that had information in it. But it's not simple like that. Because this piece of DNA makes a little protein that comes over here and sticks on this piece of DNA over here, which turns on or turns off a gene.
Oh my goodness, it's like self-modifying code.
Oh, it's worse than that. Because this piece of DNA over here makes just an RNA that goes over here and interferes with this gene's RNA. They stick together, they interfere, they conflict with one another, they turn things on, they turn things off. And if you want to draw that out, you would need a sheet of paper, a very big sheet of paper. You'd have to write all the letters of DNA out on all 3 billion of them. It would take, I calculated, about 850 Bibles as one human genome. And then you have to draw lines or arrows from one part to another part, because this part turns this part off, this part interferes with this part enhances this. It's this huge 2-dimensional interaction network. And that's why you have a 2-dimensional genome.
So it sounds like, I mean, let me stop here for a second, because this is really amazing to think about this, because I think in terms of a computer program that it's fairly static. I mean, the instructions are there, but you're talking about a program that is reprogramming itself. It's modifying its own instructions.
Oh, wait till I get to the 4th dimension.
Oh, okay.
It's because of the 3rd dimension first. The genome also folds into a 3-dimensional shape. And so a 3D, the 3rd dimension, is actually the shape. And the genes that are buried inside this ball of DNA, they're not active, they're turned off. The genes that are exposed are the ones that are used. So whoever programmed that string knew when it folded up which genes will be available at what time.
I say, are you saying that when this instruction set folds onto itself, it creates a whole new set of instructions?
Yeah, absolutely. And
that's mind-boggling.
The information in that 1st dimension, that linear string, has to be organized in such a way that when it folds into the 3rd dimension, it still works.
Oh, that's amazing.
But it's amazing. When they first sequenced the human genome, some scientists sat down, they did something I would have done. They said, okay, let's look at genes that we know are used in a biochemical pathway. They might have like 10 genes in a row to convert this into something over here. Well, if I was programmed it, I would have stuck them right next to each other in the genome. So they looked, and they weren't next to each other. They're random. They said, these genes are used on different chromosomes, they're backwards, they're forwards, they said, look at all the evidence of evolution, it's just junk. Random changes over millions of years, throw all this stuff together willy-nilly, it's just nonsense.
And we've heard that a lot.
We've heard that a whole lot.
Junk DNA.
Yes, but then someone figured out how to look at the genome in 3 dimensions. First of all, they realized the genome folds in a fractal pattern. And it's beautiful. But it's in a fractal pattern that doesn't make knots. And so it folds up, and then when they figured out where the genes were, genes that are used together are next to each other in 3D space. Even if they're on different chromosomes. When the chromosomes fold, they bring those 2 genes next to each other, and usually this cluster of genes is right next to a nuclear pore. So when God programmed these genes, he knew that when he had to turn all these genes on, he needed them in 3-dimensional space next to each other. So the whole biochemical pathway can be turned on. The little things are copied into RNA. The RNA comes outside the nucleus, is turned into protein. Voila.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay, so you've about blown my mind with that, but you said there's another dimension here.
Oh yeah, the 4th dimension is time.
And how does that work?
The genome changes shape over time. Remember I said that some genes are buried and some are exposed? Well, you need those buried genes at some time. And so at different stages of development, or sleeping versus waking, or stress versus non-stress, or after maybe you eat something that's bad for you, and your liver says, I can get rid of that toxin. Now, your earlobes, they don't care, they don't know what to do, but your liver says, I know what to do. The chromosomes in the liver will change shape, expose that new protein gene, make copies of it, build a brand new protein that can kill off that toxin, and when it's not needed anymore, they'll change shape again and fold back.
Oh my goodness. So what you're saying is that we could look at this, I mean, from a very simple perspective, and come up with the phrase called junk DNA.
Yes.
And then we can even look at it when it's folded, even though that is complex, and say, oh, there's still some strange things in there. But you're saying, if it's not being used, we might not recognize its importance until it is.
But some of the information in the genome is like scaffolding in the building. The reason this piece of DNA is here is because when it folds into the 3 dimensions, it needs these 2 genes to be next to each other.
Right.
So this stretch here might not have a functional protein associated with it, but it still has a function. It's very important. So most of the so-called junk DNA has been brought into the functional category, just not in the way the standard paradigm predicted. And it's funny because the more amazing, the more complex things become, the harder it is for the standard paradigm to explain it. That 3-dimensional ball of DNA changes over the 4th dimension. But the interaction networks in that 2nd dimension, they change. Because this gene turns off, well, that affects this one over here. This one no longer talks to that one over there. But it's worse, it's even more complicated than that. It's the 1st dimension, that linear string, the program changes. The computer software people, they don't like programs that dynamically rewrite themselves. You get all sorts of catastrophe, but we've learned that in the human brain cells have different genomes to other brain cells. They're these little pieces of DNA that they make a circle and they pop out and they go over and they float somewhere else in the genome and they stick themselves in there and they turn genes on and they turn genes off. And now we have different pieces of DNA in different brain cells, and that directs what type of brain cell it will become. But our liver cells, they have different genomes also. There's a lot of chromosomal duplications that happen in the liver. Because if you need a biochemical pathway and a lot of it, well, make extra copies of those protein genes. But different liver cells have different copies of different chromosomes. And we've learned that in the mouse embryo, there's a jumping gene, a junk piece of DNA, an ancient viral infection, the standard paradigm says, which is balderdash. It's not true. Because this little piece of DNA has to excise itself and jump around in the mouse embryo to turn genes on and turn genes off. And if you deactivate that little piece of DNA, you don't get development. It stops. So it's necessary in the mouse. It's probably something similar also probably happens in us. Dynamic programming. All 3 levels change in the 4th level, time.
Rob, that's so far beyond anything that we know, even in our most complex software systems, that it's almost beyond imagination to think that someone would look at that and say it all happened by chance.
Yes, and it only brings glory to God.
It does.
Because the more complex it becomes, the less possible it is to explain with natural, simple mutational processes. And we realize that God is so far above us in intelligence. We don't program computers like that because we're not that smart. But He made us in His image. We're good at copying things. I predict that computers in the future are going to be different because of what we're learning in the genome.
Well, we've done that in the past, and we were talking earlier about how man has looked at the flight of birds and studied them aerodynamically, and from that we've been able to create aircraft.
Yes.
But it's hard for me right now to think that what you're talking about, that we could even come close to replicating.
Not yet, not with any technology we have right now. We are limited to silicon chips right now, and that is so incredibly primitive compared to the technology that God engineered directly into life.
Rob, there's a complexity here that is just hard to imagine, hard to even get your mind around. And yet the conventional paradigm would tell us that all of this happened as a result of random processes over billions of years. But that's hard to imagine that could happen.
It is becoming impossible to imagine based on what we're learning, but all different levels of life. I mean, the genome, you can't build something like that up one thing at a time. You need it to function. In all its interlocking four-dimensional complexity, it's not something you can do one letter at a time with natural selection.
It all has to be there.
Yeah, in the same way when we talked about the environment out here on the coral reef, if you don't have all these interlocking pieces to that puzzle, you don't have that ecology. The system will come crashing down if you just remove a couple of very important factors that are there. They have to be together or it doesn't happen.
So not only did we have this interdependency, this mutualism, so to speak, down at the genetic level, now we even make it more complex by saying there is that same mutualism at the higher level as well.
Yes. In fact, the entire world has a mutualism. Think about it. Everything on Earth depends upon photosynthesis. Everything depends upon plants grabbing sunlight, storing that energy in sugar molecules. If that didn't exist, nothing else would exist.
So we're back to this notion, to some extent, of this, the fact that the whole creation itself is built in relationships with each other. It's all interconnected. There are relationships between pieces that we haven't even been able to see and think about.
And yet we're continually discovering
and
more.
we're discovering them.
There are some who would turn at this point to Gaia, or the universe being conscious or alive. It doesn't fly because they're still appealing to this conventional millions of years paradigm, and they're still trying to build it up step by step. It doesn't work that way. You cannot build high technology step by step.
Right.
It takes a leap of technology to produce something like a starfish from nothing.
Rob, what you're saying here is that it's impossible to think that all of this could have happened just by a series of slow processes over billions of years.
That's exactly what I'm saying. When we talk about the cell, we have to talk about technology. When we talk about technology, we have to talk about intelligence. When we look at the mutual interdependence of everything that's happening inside the cell, we realize systems like that don't come about through a stepwise process. You've got things that have to exist or life cannot exist. And they're intrinsic and important and found throughout all of life. It has to be not built up stepwise, but the whole system laid out, spun up, and then God let go. And there it works.
Well, Rob, I have to ask you this question then. We are accused often of just taking a leap of faith here in believing the Genesis paradigm. Do you think it's a leap of faith for what you believe?
There is certainly an aspect of faith involved in any science. I put my faith in my Redeemer, Jesus Christ. I put my faith in my God. But at the same time, when I'm looking at the world, my world is fitting in with what I read about God and about creation in the Bible. I don't have a gigantic scientific conflict. I'm not turning my mind off. I'm actually thinking through these things, and my colleagues, we are thinking through these issues, and it is a wonderful place to be right now. Because right now, with the technology that we're developing and the understanding that we're experiencing, it is only pointing toward our Creator.
Where we're having an enlightening discussion with scientist and best-selling author Greg Braden of the USA. When he first began studying human origins, Mr. Braden wondered whether humankind was just a genetic coincidence or was intentionally engineered. Let's now find out how his research took shape.
I don't know who or what or how, but the evidence is overwhelming that there is an intentionality and a design that underlies our existence. So as a scientist, my thinking was, if that's true, who or whatever put us here on Earth would have left something inside of every one of us that tells us we're part of a greater existence and tells us that we're a family and that we're not so different from one another. And if I could find that, if I could find that common denominator, that somehow maybe it would help us to become greater than the differences, that began a search. And I combined the science that I know of biology and history and ancient language, linguistics, genetics, with the new science of computers that were now on my desktop. And Daryl, I'll tell you, I remember the very first time as a scientist that I had the opportunity to see the human genome, a piece of human DNA coded on my computer screen. And all the CTAG, it all rolled down through the screen. And my brain looked at that. And I remember thinking, I said, I don't know what that says, but there's a code. There's a language. That DNA is a language. And whatever that language is, it's inside of me, and it's inside of everyone that looks at it. And some intelligent being placed it there a long time ago.
Using all the technology at his disposal, Mr. Braden then began searching for the message encoded in our DNA.
And this led to a research project using computers, the best science of today, and some of those ancient texts. And the bottom line is that what we discovered is every single ancient language, the letters of the language link to very precise numbers that have never changed. So whether we're talking about the Arabic language or the Hebrew language, or if we're talking about cuneiform and Sanskrit, what are called the ancient core or the ancient root languages, there's a mysterious number that's always been linked to those letters, and nobody knows where the numbers came from. That was interesting to me. So through a process that took many years, I came to understand that the numbers that represent the letter are also the numbers that represent the elements, what we call the elements on the periodic table of life and a physical reality as we know it. So in other words, it is if the ancients, they didn't know about the periodic table of elements the way we do today, but they knew about the numbers that were represented. And when we make the connections between the letters of the ancient alphabets, the numbers they represent, those numbers, if we look at them on the periodic table, they happen to be precisely the elements that make the DNA in our bodies. Now, we have the ability to take the sequences of DNA in a cell and through those numbers link them to letters in ancient alphabets. And lo and behold, the letters spell words and the words have meaning. And this has led to a book that's entitled The God Code. It was released in the year 2004. What we know is that there is a message, an intentional message within the DNA of all life. The message occurs in layers, and each layer has its own code that must be understood for that layer. And I'm still working on the deeper layers.
Greg Braden says the message hidden in the DNA of all living beings is that which spiritual masters have tried to convey to humanity through the ages. He now reveals what's written in the topmost layer of our genetic code.
The top layer is one that we understand very well right now. The top layer in the DNA of all life literally translates into the words God, eternal, within the body. God, eternal, within the body. We don't know who put that message there. We don't know exactly why it's there. But I can tell you that all I did was I followed the instructions in a series of ancient texts following those languages, and I married that with the science of today, and this is what we found. If a higher intelligence is responsible for our existence, and that intelligence created us, it makes perfect sense that that intelligence would have left something for us to understand who we are. And if they left it in a temple or a text that could be destroyed or disappear over time, it wouldn't make sense. It makes perfect sense that that higher intelligence would have left the message encoded into the creation itself. And as long as the creation exists, the message is intact.
We've shown that DNA is actually the software of life. It's totally interchangeable between the digital world and the biological world.
The DNA code itself
is so digital, is so almost exactly like a computer tape.
Totally interchangeable.
DNA code itself.
It's the software of life.
Is so digital.
Scientists have come to the amazing conclusion that our bodies contain digital code. In fact, Bill Gates, you know, the founder of Microsoft, tweeted, "DNA is more advanced than any software ever created." Think about it. A program or code is written by someone very smart. The more complex the code, the more intelligent the author has to be. So here's the question. If our DNA code is more complex than any man-made software, where did it come from? Is it possible it was authored without an author, programmed without a programmer? Materialists think so, through neo-Darwinism, the modern version of Darwinian evolution. Stephen Meyer, author of the New York Times bestseller Darwin's Doubt, explains.
According to neo-Darwinism, new genetic information arises as a result of random mutations in the arrangement of the nucleotide bases along the spine of the DNA molecule. If those random changes are beneficial, they're passed on and preserved, and if many such changes are preserved and passed on, they would accumulate over time and eventually result in a very significant change in the morphology, the form of the organism.
That's like saying if this game had glitches every time it was copied online, and gamers shared their favorite mutated versions and trashed the rest, it would eventually turn into this. Come on, really? If we know the computer glitches won't produce a new video game, how much sense does it make to believe that glitches, copying errors, in our DNA code can produce new organisms? Could random mutations in DNA really produce this? 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 What about this? 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 Or this?
Everything we know about software shows that random changes in a section of functional code or functional information is going to degrade that information long before you ever get to something fundamentally new. And that's the problem with the mutation selection mechanism as an explanation for new genetic information. Information in DNA is also essentially typographic or digital, and there are far more ways to go wrong in arranging those characters than there are ways to go right. And so as you begin to randomly change them, you inevitably fall into a non-functional abyss long before you ever generate anything fundamentally new.
So just how unlikely is it for random genetic changes to produce something new, even something as modest as a protein structure with a new function? One scientist performed experiments that enabled him to actually calculate the odds, and they aren't good. In fact, they're next to impossible. We caught up with a molecular biologist, Douglas Axe, in Seattle.
In our lab work, we've asked how rare or how common functional proteins are within the space of possibilities. Doing experiments and calculations, we found that they're exceedingly rare, like 1 in 10 to the 74th power rare. To get a feel for those odds, imagine that somebody hid one atom somewhere within the Milky Way galaxy, and you, blindfolded by chance, are supposed to pick one atom and hope that it's the right one. Those odds would be better than the odds for the protein.
Axe calculated the probability for all the chance mutations in all of the life forms on Earth for billions of years. And in all that time, he found they couldn't chance on even one new functional protein structure. Not one. 0. And keep in mind, it takes thousands of distinct proteins to build any kind of complex life, including humans. And many of these proteins are unique to each individual life form. So we go from improbable to basically impossible.
The bottom line is that the mutation selection mechanism simply lacks the creative power to generate the new information necessary to build new organisms in the history of life.
If the material processes of mutation and natural selection aren't capable of producing the biological information needed for life, then where did it come from?
Our uniform and repeated experience, as Darwin himself pointed out, is the basis of all scientific reasoning about the past. So when we see information in a digital form in software, or we see a paragraph in a book, and we trace that information back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. That's part of what we know from our observation of the world around us, that information always arises from an intelligent source. So we can apply that knowledge to the question of historical biology. And when we see that information is the foundation of life, we can infer that the best explanation for the origin of that information is in fact also a mind, a conscious agent, not an undirected material process.
When presented with evidence that conflicts with neo-Darwinism, most scientists cling to a belief in the blind process of evolution, denying what science has discovered. That at the foundation of life, there exists a code so complex and advanced that it defies chance. They make no room for the possibility that we were created by an intelligence far more sophisticated than the most genius of programmers. Instead, they choose to limit their investigation to a strictly materialist worldview. When faced with this evidence, how will you respond?
From the smallest atom to the largest galaxy, everything in the universe obeys the laws of physics, where our brains are made of the same atoms or molecules as the rest of the universe. So could we take this theory further and ask whether consciousness could be part of the underlying fabric of the universe? Humans have also managed to extend this to the internet, where there is an eerie pattern between the universe, the brain, and the internet, where experts have been asking the question whether the internet could one day develop its own consciousness. Maybe in the distant future, all three will unite into one giant mind. Humans have always been fascinated with the thought that the universe somehow reflects us, and whether the universe could be a giant brain. Let's delve deeper into the trinity that is the universe, the brain, and the internet. Number 3, the universe. Nature's scientific reports republished a study that shows the galaxy expanding and growing in patterns very similar to that of the human brain. So, does life in the universe follow a natural pattern? Combining astronomy and physics allows us to look at network growth pattern like the human brain, the internet, and the galaxy. They all seem to follow a natural law. If you study nature, you will see that the human body reflects a natural pattern where our brain grows in very interesting ways by connecting clusters of brain cells to each other using neurons as pathways. The electrical firing and linking by these pockets keeps expanding and connecting in order to form a massive complex network, very much like the internet. The giant brain theory is even more compelling now that we know our universe fabric grows like a brain in addition to being conscious. This theory follows the laws of physics everywhere, in that the universe appears to be the brain of a giant body, where the cosmic web and the brain cells look alike. Brain cells and galaxies might appear very different, but a recent computer simulation suggests they might be governed by the single fundamental law of nature. Atoms are like solar systems, where the large-scale structure of the universe is like neurons in a human brain. And there's an interesting coincidence that the number of stars in a galaxy, galaxies in the universe, atoms in a cell, and cells in a living being are all approximately the same large number. When the universe is compared with other networks, it was found that all expand in eerily similar ways, which appear more than a coincidence. According to a study published in Nature's Scientific Reports, the universe may be growing in the same way as a giant brain, with the electrical firing between brain cells mirrored by the shape of expanding galaxies. Number 2, the brain. There is still much to learn about this walnut-shaped organ. If you actually magnified the brain, the physical brain becomes a neuron brain, which is composed of neurons and electrical currents connected through signals. The brain, as we naturally view it, appears as nothing more than a piece of flesh, but under magnification would be seen as a grouping of neurons. However, if we further magnify the brain, the neurons become atoms, and if we are now looking at the whole body, we are now nothing more than atoms. We're no longer flesh and bones, but atoms. Now, if we further magnify our brain, existence has now become a quantum brain. What was once a body has become nothing more than thoughts and information. What we call the material dimension is now the quantum dimension. There is no difference between the dimension of matter, the dimension of atoms, and the quantum dimension. It is all one existence. So, our brain is not only our universe, but it is somehow connected to the universe. Number 1, the Internet. The Internet is like a worldwide brain, where there is a similarity in the laws of networks that suggest that the structure of the universe and the laws that govern its growth are similar to the structure and growth of the human brain and other complex networks such as the Internet. The similarity between the networks is amazing, where we are connected to the universe, and in turn the universe is a reflection of ourselves. When we compare the brain and the Internet, we start at the cerebral cortex, which is made from billions of neurons or brain cells that fire together, resulting in simple pattern recognition to long-term memory. The Internet is made up of hundreds of millions of computers that include mobile phones and other kinds of automated machines that communicate over the net, where there are many layers that can link any 2 points on the Internet. We know that the brain is one of the most complex networks in the world, with more neurons than there are stars in the galaxy. Its hardware is a complex network of neurons, its software a complex network of memories. And so too is the Internet, where its hardware is a complex network of computers. Its software is a complex network of websites. There is a lot we can learn from the brain, and it can tell us where the Internet is headed next. The brain delivers all our mental capabilities that enables us to love music, cry, laugh, and love. Although in comparison the Internet is much slower and smaller than the average brain, the basic structure is the same.
I end with this. Humanity is unique and special, and deep down we are complex creatures. Never believe that your existence was for nothing, because we are fearfully and wonderfully made.
for thou hast possessed my reins. Thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect. And in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them.
DNA proves intelligent design. DNA proves God. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. Be blessed and shalom.